now Citrus County's top political podcast.
At some point you look around, and you're the only one.
It's pretty good.
And just like that, the perspective shifts.
Paging Bobby Winsler to the microphone. On in 3, 2.
Welcome in! Coming to you from the Concurrent Media Network in the heart of Citrus County. However you're making us part of your day, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, or even through the Concurrent website, we are sure glad you're joining us. This show brought to you today by Vellum. As events are returning, make sure yours stands out with professional marketing for your big day. Vellum, the difference is in the design. Learn more at TampaBayVellum.com. That's Tampa Bay, VELLUM.com. Hope you're having a great day. It's always one of those favorites for me, June 1st, when we get to flip the calendar page over. It's a chance to reflect on how far we've come and look forward with optimism toward all that can be accomplished in the month ahead. Plus, you get the new photo on the calendar if you're still using a paper one like me. Speaking of photos, this is a really cool story before we get into it today. My wife Rachel and I went to St. Augustine this weekend, which you already knew if you read Sunday's column, and I had referenced City Hall with all the flags out in front and the names tied to the flags. It left such an impression on me that I wrote about it. And unbeknownst to me, Rachel, who was a few steps behind me, we were letting some pedestrians pass, was also so impacted by the sight that she snapped a picture of it. And that's what's on the story now. So check it out if you have it already. And if you have, when it was first published, the updated picture on there, which I didn't even know she took until she read it, my column the next morning, the updated picture on there is worth revisiting the story. But moving right along, I hope you also enjoyed the long weekend. That in reference to a public relations blunder from Vice President Kamala Harris mentioned in that column on Sunday. Now look. Before you draw partisan lines, let's practice what I'm going to preach today. That is to recognize where the other side would be coming from and to overcome personal bias toward analyzing an incident as objectively as possible. So, I think that news stories like the outrage that followed this tweet are largely a distraction that are meant to divide. I don't think the vice president wrote the tweet. I don't think the vice president even read the tweet before it was sent. But I do think that it's at least some bit about the perceived voice of the office. And how this is related to my personal life is that right after my first election cycle in Citrus, I had a lot more time on my hands, so I started volunteering. I did a cleanup with one rake at a time. I volunteered at a Y for Kids Triathlon, all this stuff going on. And I said to Rachel, we were dating at the time, she's now my wife, I said, hey, volunteering lets me meet all these new contacts in a setting where they know it's the right thing to do. It's a great PR. She looked at me funny, and she says, yeah. Plus, volunteering is the right thing to do. And that's where I'm at with this tweet. Recognizing Memorial Day would have been both a good public relations thing to do, and it's also the right thing to do. I understand I just related an instance in my own life to an instance of how it could happen on the national stage, but I'll remind you that mine happened while I was in my 20s, not a heartbeat away from the Oval Office. And I recognize she didn't write it, she probably didn't even approve it, but still it should be a wake-up call to the perceived message strategy of those who did write it and approve it, especially when the right thing to do from a moral perspective was also the right thing to do from a PR perspective. So, objectively, we can call this a blunder. Did I, too, create a blunder this weekend with something I said about the Chronicle? More on that in topic 2. But first, let's get to this. Have you ever heard of a hot take? There are certainly political hot takes, but the term is still more used in sports media context. And I'll give you the most famous hot take of all time. Stop me if you've heard this before. Tom Brady's career is over! That's a hot take. It was a hot take in 2014. It was a hot take when he left the Patriots 2 years ago. It will still be a hot take today. But it did have some circumstantial evidence to support why somebody would make what is in hindsight an outrageous prediction. We forget that Tom Brady went a decade without winning a Super Bowl. From 2004 to 2014, he went to 2 Super Bowls, but was thwarted from winning either by Eli Manning. A 10-year drought. And when you start to consider that, those predictions that say his career is over, they didn't seem so far-fetched. Now, of course, he's gone on to be to 5 more Super Bowls, lose 1 to the Eagles, win 3 more with the Patriots, and of course 1 most recently with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And now he's 44 years old, but the Bucs become the first team in the Super Bowl era to return 22 of 22 starters on their roster, having just won the Super Bowl the previous year. So, we'll see. I don't think many people are making that hot take now, but it still wouldn't be without reason. Now, I am going to make a hot take today regarding county affairs. It will sound conspiratorial, and it may even reflect negatively on me in the future if it turns out to be wrong. But I think the stakes are too high to not at least introduce the possibility of this happening. Here's my hot take. The county will stick to their $8 to $9 million budget for the animal shelter and vote to use all the private money raised both previously and since the 3-2 vote last month toward the add-ons rather than toward offsetting the taxpayer cost. Let me word this slightly differently. This would mean the total cost of the animal shelter will be roughly $11 million, which is $9 million from county taxpayer public funds, and what will be about $2 to $2.5 million in private fund raised. Let me phrase this another way. The entire animal shelter in 2021 will be twice what the entire Inverness Government Center cost in 2006. Let me put this another way. The entire cost of the animal shelter will be what the Chronicle said on April 30th, quote, Citrus County needs a new animal shelter. It does not have to be an $11 million palace recommended by a consultant, end quote. And hey, if you think my editorial content and podcasts sound a little conspiratorial, this is the sentence from the Chronicle that immediately followed that quote. Let's remember, consultants are usually brought in to place a high price tag on an improvement so that public support disappears. Consultants are usually just cynical delaying tactics by those same politicians who oppose making changes, end quote. So, you know what? We're all a little guilty of the hot takes. But my evidence for why I think private funds raised from the Chronicle are going to go toward the add-ons instead of offsetting the cost of the base shelter is because of a concept, non-academic, that I would best describe as word soup. Now, Rachel and I don't have kids, but we do teach a lot, her with the dance studio, and me locally with the rowing team when I can. And even, honestly, sometimes I get some word soup from my college students down in Tampa. Well, I'm sure my parents out there already know what I'm talking about. So that you know that I know what I'm talking about, word soup sounds something like this. You find out your teenager went to a party and they didn't tell you about it. And when you ask why they lied about going to the party, your kid responds, "Well, I told you I was going to Jenny's," which I did, and then we went to Jake's after that for a little bit. But I went back to Jenny's after that, and I was there before we left. So really I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything differently than what I told you I was doing. That's word soup. The more academic phrasing might be lying by omission. The Chronicle's fundraiser for the animal shelter, which has now raised almost $26,000, was introduced with the following quote: "Therefore, we invite all animal advocates to send a contribution to the Chronicle Animal Shelter Fund. We pledge those dollars will be used for the stated purpose." For the stated purpose? What? That's word soup. It's purposefully omitting the stated purpose of private funds is not for the main shelter, but for the add-ons. If you think I'm in the weeds on this, let me present you with one other bit of information. The Shelter Me Citrus fundraiser for the animal shelter, which has raised north of $15,000 on its own, says in the description on the donation Facebook page, quote, "The BOCC has committed to building a new shelter that will satisfy necessities. The funds collected here will supplement what the county is providing to help ensure that a new shelter meets the needs now and in the future, giving them the ability to meet the best practices in animal welfare. With your generous support, the new shelter building fund, you can contribute to a better community." Let's contrast for a second. This was the Shelter Me Citrus. Quote, "The funds collected here will supplement what the county is providing," end quote. With what the Chronicle said, quote, "We pledge those dollars will be used for the stated purpose," end quote. Now, you tell me which effort sounds like it's engaging in word soup. The irony here is that the Citrus County Foundation for Animal Protection, who is spearheading the new shelter building fund, has every motivation to be heavy-handed in their wording because they've been advocating for this for years, maybe even decades, and they don't have a professional standard of journalism to uphold. The Chronicle, that has every responsibility to be as straightforward as possible as a newspaper of record and as an influential voice in the community, yet has the messaging that is best described as word soup, and at worst is misleading by omission. And if you're thinking, geez, Bobby, it says the funds are going to the animal shelter. Even with the add-ons, the funds are going to the animal shelter. What does it matter how it's worded? Well, there was nothing factually inaccurate about Vice President Harris's tweet saying enjoy the long weekend. It was the omission of Memorial Day. It violates the spirit of what we were honoring during last weekend. The Chronicle's "for the stated purpose" may mean go to animal shelter add-ons, which is still the animal shelter, not factually inaccurate, but that violates why people may be donating, which would be to reduce the cost of the public project. This is made abundantly clear when you put in contrast to how concise the organization, who has every reason to be pushing the limits of what it takes to get donations rolling in, is as straightforward as it can be. The same Chronicle editorial that introduced the fundraiser that says funds will be used for the stated purpose also said, quote, "One of the artificial roadblocks originally thrown up by the county administration to derail the animal shelter proposal was getting a consultant to establish the outrageous price tag of $11.5 million on the project," end quote. I believe when the dust settles on this, the funds will be used in such a way by the Commission and by the Chronicle that we will still spend $9 million of taxpayer funds and the private funds, which should total around $2.5 million, that will be used on the add-ons, bringing the total cost of the shelter to that $11.5 million that was consistently reported as being too high a price to pay, and that could be reduced if we just stopped for a moment to consider other options. Why do we overpay? It's not corruption or greed or even ignorance. In this case, it's 3 commissioners and a newspaper willing to sacrifice conservative principles for expediency. I hope I'm not wrong. I really do. But we saw it with the CARES Act money, we're seeing it with the shelter, and we're undoubtedly going to see it with trash collection in the near future. And it's going to cost us down the line. Getting to topic 2, but first, this show brought to you today by Vellum. As events are returning, make sure yours stands out with professional marketing for your big day. Vellum, the difference is in the design. Learn more at TampaBayVellum.com. That's Tampa Bay, VELLUM.com. Okay. I wrote a column on Sunday in which the culmination point that I actually got the attention of some other people who mentioned it to me in person or texted me about it. That culmination point had a quote about the Chronicle editorial. It said that they are editorial board. It said the Chronicle editorial board is uninterested in debate. They want agreement. This is incendiary. This is accusatory. I don't think this is wrong. I believe it is a paper that thinks they are creating common ground while subtly perpetuating an environment of elimination. The goal is to eliminate one side from being heard at all. We can all come together on an issue, they may be thinking, as long as you agree with us on that issue. Unfortunately, the culture of reciprocity that exists at the paper is one in which they'll abandon principles of journalism in order to perpetuate a narrative to help their friends. Recently, they reprinted a story from Center Square. It's a think tank and a media outlet known for stretching the truth on what would pass as pure journalistic integrity. This, its critics say, is due to its heavy conservative bias. Coincidentally, this is probably exactly what the Chronicle might say about content from the Concurrent, although we are a news aggregator, not a news outlet, and editorial content source rather than a journalistic outlet. And we're upfront about the conservative bias. So why does a Chronicle run a story from a source that is known to be heavily conservative and criticized for its lack of journalistic integrity? Because that story helped the Chamber of Commerce. Throw principle out the window. Throw professional standards out the window. The content fits the narrative and gets the go-ahead. Here's the Concurrent's narrative. Try to find common ground and debate when disagreement does arise, but don't try to implement moderation or elimination. Moderation is often touted as, I wish more people were in the center. If there were more moderates, then we would be able to achieve more. I don't believe this to be true. If you're a moderate, there's nothing wrong with that, but don't think the only way to get stuff done is to temper your own beliefs. The practice of responsible governing may demand this as an outcome. Compromise is a necessity, but it shouldn't be the starting point. Thus, the Concurrent does not believe in moderation. You already know we don't believe in elimination because based on the Chronicle's approach. So what do we believe in? We believe in recognition and reconciliation. Recognition is understanding either the moral foundation or the viewpoint of why someone believes what they do. Reconciliation is either finding a way to debate that person toward your side, toward your moral foundation, or it is to meet in that moderate middle once again as an end point, not as a starting point. The key difference in the approach with the Concurrent from the Chronicle is that the debate has to be welcomed and the discussion has to be had. Rather than trying to eliminate part of the discussion through asking people to join your common ground, then draw the battle line until there's no one else on the field other than those who agree with you, we think instead the better way is to have the discussions, to draw the circle around each side, even larger when the two get contentious, as a reminder of the respect and decorum expected when two sides discuss serious matters. In our case, I believe this larger circle would be that we are all Citrus County residents. This is why I've never felt any ill will toward the Chronicle, or toward the Chamber for that matter, though they actively seem to work against the candidates that I represent, because I know that they too are working for what they believe is best for Citrus County. I never lose sight of that shared intentionality, and even though we may disagree, I do trust that there is still common ground as a foundation. And as Americans, recognizing Memorial Day, we can try a little harder to remind ourselves of that common ground and how it remains free because of those who are now confined to the hallowed ground, who gave what Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion in service of this great country. At the time that I wrote, the Chronicle editorial board was indifferent to debate and only wanted agreement. I may have felt that I was being too harsh. But the more I reflected on it, and the more I discussed with others, I have since reversed course. And I think that the line of delineation between the two cultures of our publications needs to be further distinguished. The reposting of the Center Square think tank article to support the Chamber's initiative made one thing abundantly clear. You can get your information from the Chronicle put into a context that makes you feel part of the crowd, yet that isn't tied to any sort of professional standards, but based only on the culture of reciprocity. Or you can continue to tune it in right here at the Concurrent, where even if you don't agree with our views, we welcome you to express your own. And we'll keep that discussion going with recognition and reconciliation until, respectfully, an outcome is reached. We'll see if anything changes with the new owners of the Chronicle parent company, a topic that will surely be revisited in the week ahead. If you want to join this conversation, find us on social at the Concurrent Facebook or Twitter, or go to the Concurrent website and post on our discussion boards. Today's episode was sponsored by Vellum. For all your traditional and digital marketing needs, turn to Vellum at TampaBayVellum.com. This is the Bobby Winsler Show, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the iHeartRadio, and on the Concurrent website. See you next week.